All right, so that first movement principle, which is the body always follows the path of least resistance. So I just wanted to demonstrate what you read in the book about kind of sitting to standing. And so when you're sitting down, okay, for a period of time, what you have to understand is that you're in this hip flex position, okay, which means all the muscles in the front of your hip are going to slowly start to adapt to the position you're in, and they're going to adaptively shorten. And if I sit here for a period of time, most people sit probably at least 5 to 7 hours a day. And now that we're in more of a virtual world here, people are probably sitting even more because they don't even have to go to an office and walk around as much. So a lot of sitting going on. And so my body starts to get tight here in the front of the hip. And when it's time to get up, the body is going to follow the path of least resistance. So right now, as I stand up, and as I said in the book, it's like, people make the noise because they're basically working through this area that's gotten tight because it's been sitting. And so in order to walk, like I said in the book, is that this hip, this bone, this femur bone, this has to be able to extend in a perfect world back about 10 degrees. And there's also a rotation that's supposed to happen in the hip that is required to walk properly in a way that doesn't put strain on other body parts. Okay. The hip is supposed to be the primary mover here, right? It's the 500 horsepower engine. So if I'm sitting for a long period of time, my hip gets all tight. And as I get up, this becomes a path of resistance because it's short and tight. So the body says, okay, well, I'm going to follow a path where there's less resistance. And it's two choices to walk. I can go into my knee, right? I could start to walk and bend my knee as opposed to extending my hip. Because if this is tight, then my body says, oh, we'll just flex the knee. We'll put the strain in the knee. That's one option. The other option is, oh, I can't get through my hip, so I'll go through my back. So I'll walk with my back. So instead of walking through my hip the way it's supposed to and really power myself forward, instead, the body follows the path of least resistance. And because there's resistance here, it goes into the knee, it goes into the back. And that's what brings me to the second movement principle, which is the body will sacrifice long-term health to survive in any moment. So right now, in this example, it's only concerned with surviving right now. And so that's why it follows the path of least resistance, because it's looking to conserve energy. And so right now, it's more conducive to survival right now if I ask my back or my knee to do the work of my hip, because in this moment, it requires less effort, less energy. In order for me to overpower that, I'd have to I got to force the hip, and maybe you feel a stretch here, and you're like, oh, that's painful. I'm working through tissue that's tight. I'm going through resistance there, which requires energy. And so the body sacrifices long-term health to survive in the moment is because it's not thinking in this moment that if I use my knee and my back or my back instead of my hip, or use them as a hip over time, I'm going to degenerate the knee and I'm going to degenerate the back. It's going to be a problem long-term. It doesn't think long-term. It just thinks right now, it's much more energy efficient for me to ask my knee and or my back to do the job of my hip. And that's a perfect example of how the body will sacrifice long-term health to survive. Now, I mentioned in the previous part about the football player that came in to see us. And I just thought this was so fascinating because he blew out his ACL. And we asked him how. And he very specifically said he was going down the sideline to catch a ball over his right shoulder. And he said he planted his left foot, and he went to turn to catch the ball, and his knee collapsed in and blew out his ACL. It's like, okay, that's relatively common in sports. But if you ask the question, why did the body do that? Why did the body over-rotate an area of the body that's not designed to rotate? We talked about how the knee is a hinge joint, not good at rotating. So why would the body do that? Why would it spin a hinge joint till it snaps, right? Well, when we went into his evaluation and looked into his health history, he actually got into a car accident a long time ago and got a neck injury. And so when we assessed his neck in other areas, he couldn't turn his head to the right very well because he had never been rehabbed properly from a car accident. It was a whiplash. And so if you think about it, right, if I plant my left leg, I need to be able to turn my head here to look back. So I'm getting rotation from my neck here in this case. Obviously, the neck has the ability to rotate as well. But if for some reason I'm compromised in my neck, think about your body's choice. It's like, okay, do I go through this area, risk injuring my neck to catch this ball, or do I pick up rotation down in the knee? I'd much rather blow out my knee than I would blow out my neck, because I can survive without a knee. I can't survive if I break my neck. Like, these are embedded into our physiology and biology. So I always thought that was a fascinating example of how our body will sacrifice health in the long term to make sure we survive, right? It's like, hey, you don't need a knee, but we definitely need to keep your neck intact. All right. So the next thing I wanted to demonstrate is strength and flexibility are only relative to the task. All right, so we'll start with flexibility here, and let's talk about this idea that strength and flexibility are only relative to the task. And so I have my yoga mat out here, and this is kind of the classic place where people will stretch. And we'll go through all these different stretches. Classic feet out in front of you, reaching to here, to over there, reach that way. And again, I'm not saying that these stretches are bad in themselves, but we need to understand that my ability to do any one of these types of movements, stretches on the ground, yoga positions, poses, it's not, if I can perform that, it doesn't mean I'm flexible. It means I could perform those movements. Because being able to get into this position here and be able to touch my toes doesn't necessarily mean that I'm able to go for a run. Because as you can see here, touching my toes or reaching out over to this way or reaching out that way looks nothing like running, looks nothing like throwing a baseball, looks nothing like picking something up off the floor, right? Now, it doesn't make these things bad, but we have to understand that there's a delta between what I'm doing here and what I want the body to be up to. So the flexibility that you're looking for needs to look like the activities that you're up to, because if they don't, there's not going to be a correlation. And same with strength. Strength is only relative to the task. So same thing. Let's look at some of the classic core exercises, right? Here's one: plank, hold and squeeze, hold and squeeze, hold and squeeze, strengthening my core. I got to make my core stronger. Or some of the classic ones I showed in the video is like the dead bug exercises. I need to get my core stronger because my back hurts when I bend over. It's like, well, this core exercise better be one very small part of the program to get you back to bend over to pick something up, if it's even necessary at all. Because again, how does this correlate to being able to bend over and not have my back hurt? It's a big delta there, right? Big gap. And so the big takeaway with this movement principle is to understand that you want to ask the question when you're trying to get more flexible, trying to build strength. Ask the question, what am I specifically trying to get strong for? What am I specifically trying to get flexible for? If it's golf, then your stretches should look like you're playing golf. If it's everyday movements like picking stuff up, lifting stuff over, lifting your arms over your head, then the stretches better look like those actions if you're trying to build flexibility and strength for them. So important. Movement principle number 4 is that the body moves through 3 dimensions, macro and micro. So the 3 dimensions of movement are the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse or horizontal plane. So sagittal plane motion is basically forward to back. So me walking towards the camera is sagittal plane. Me walking backwards is a sagittal plane global motion. If I was to shuffle side to side, that's a global frontal plane motion. If I was to stand here and spin around like a top, that's a rotational movement globally. So we can move through these 3 planes of motion at a macro level. Now, where it gets really fun is at a micro level, we can also move in all 3 planes of motion. So the hip, as an example, is a very complicated and dynamic joint because it's a ball and socket joint. So hips can move in the sagittal plane, forward and back. They can move in the frontal plane, side to side, and they can move in the rotational plane. And from a micro standpoint, you can have the femur doing all the motion, sagittal, femur doing all the motion, frontal, femur doing all the motion from the transverse or horizontal plane. You can also create hip motion sagittally with the pelvis. So that same bone is flexing, but my pelvis is rocking over the femur. I can get the frontal plane by tipping my pelvis side to side. And I can get the transverse plane by turning my pelvis rotating. That would be what would happen in a golf swing, at least we hope, is that you're getting that pelvis to rotate around the femur to load the glutes properly. All right. And so every single joint in your body has an ability to rotate in all 3 planes. So as you remember in the book, the lumbar spine, if you look at the lumbar spine, you'll see those facet joints that I mentioned in the book. Now, those facet joints, if you can notice, they inhibit rotation. So if I try to rotate this, you'll notice that those facet joints hit each other, right? Right there. You can see that right there. As I turn that, they bump into each other. It's not very efficient at rotation, but it still can do it a little bit. It's much more efficient in the frontal plane and much more efficient in the sagittal plane, backwards and forwards, flexion and extension. Okay, not so good in the transverse plane. And as I mentioned in the book, we get into the T-spine, thoracic spine. Those facet joints aren't really there as much, so I can rotate much further. Look at the difference, right? Much easier to rotate in the thoracic spine based on the structure versus the lumbar, right? These are weight-bearing joints. These are very big, strong, hunky joints. Not very good at rotating, very good at going forward and back and side to side. And so every single joint in your body has the ability to go through 3 planes of motion. In the power regions video, I'm going to show you the foot and ankle, the hip, and the T-spine, again, to show you why they're power regions. But what we need to understand is any motion you perform, you're moving through a global plane of motion, like walking, for example, is globally sagittal plane. But if you were to look at every joint in the body when you're walking, there is frontal plane, sagittal plane, and transverse plane motion happening at every joint. And a good example of that is if you think about the hips when they walk, you take that left foot and you put it in front of you. If you can see the ball and socket joint, what has to happen in order for me to walk in a sagittal plane global motion is I have to be able to rotate my pelvis around my femur to extend it properly. Okay. And so that's just the simplest example of the intricacy of walking and how walking is basically a summation of rotation through the entire system in order to do a simple sagittal plane global motion. One example of that with walking is just the pelvis and the rib cage. So when you take a step forward with your left legs in front, right? So I'm stepping forward with my left leg, my pelvis is facing to the right and my rib cage is facing to the left. So there's this huge rotation through the system when I walk, right? We don't walk with our arms at our side. We walk when our left leg's in front of us, our right arm is in front. And then we step with the right arm, the left arm comes in front. There is all this rotation happening through the entire chain in order to walk straight. Okay, so wickedly intricate, wickedly complex, but super fun to assess. So that's principle number 4, micro and macro three-dimensional. All right, and the last movement principle is muscles lengthen to load. And so that, I spoke a little bit about this in the previous part of the video, where exercise paradigm focuses on contracting the muscle, shortening the muscle, shortening the muscle, shortening the muscle. Well, movement paradigm understands that we have to lengthen muscles in order to get them to load. And I mentioned that you want to think about muscles like rubber bands. So here's the best example of it. And so if you look at the musculature, you'll notice that the muscle in the back of the body, as you can see from this picture here, their biggest muscles are on the back of the body, and it's almost like it's one giant muscle. So if you look closely, you'll see that you can follow. And so the best way to think about it is to think about one giant muscle that goes from the bottom of your foot all the way to the top of your head. And and there's some practitioners like Thomas Myers who have connected, he calls them fascial anatomy trains, where he has shown that the musculature and fascial system basically function as if they're one giant muscle, like I'm about to demonstrate to you. Anatomy Trains is his book. And so if you think about it, think about one giant muscle that starts at the bottom of my foot, goes all the way up to my head. And when I'm going to bend over to pick something up, like I said in the previous video, gravity's pulling me down, right? And all of these muscles are lengthening as a result of me bending over properly. So my calf, my hamstring, my butt, my spine is flexed, my head's looking down, and every muscle behind me is lengthening, and it brings me back home. Okay? It's the lengthening of these muscles that actually turn them on and produce power. And it's the same example I used with the volleyball player in the beginning of the book, when going up to hit a volleyball smash, right? A spike or throw a ball. The most efficient way to do that is to get all these muscles to lengthen properly, especially the hip. Remember, this is the big powerful muscle, and then it unloads, okay? It's the more efficiently I lengthen this thing through the kinetic chain, the more efficient I will unload, okay? And so you'd never throw a baseball like this, right? Oh, let me contract it. No. Lengthen everything and then unload it. Golf swing is the same thing, right? The more efficient I can sequentially load, and if there's an activity where you need your power regions, golf is one of them, because you need your foot and ankle, you need your hip, and you need your T-spine, all rotating at a very high level in order to produce that efficiently, right? Golf golf and tennis is another one. Huge rotational sports. And if you have any kind of injuries in those, I can almost guarantee one of your power regions, if not a couple of them, are not operating optimally. All right. So principle number 5, muscles lengthen to load. Think of your muscles like rubber band. That's movement paradigm principle number 5.